For years, I felt like there was something inside me that didn't make sense, something that separated me from other people. I was good at certain things, even excellent, but in the simplest situations, casual conversations, a shared laugh at work, that kind of human connection that seems so natural to everyone, I always fell behind. Little did I know that what I saw as flaws or oddities was actually something much bigger. This is the story of how I learned to see the missing pieces, understand who I really was, and, most importantly, accept that being different was never the problem. Routine was my refuge. The coffee maker hummed in the kitchen while I meticulously arranged the breakfast table with almost mathematical precision. The curtains let the soft morning light flood the space, casting delicate shadows on the wooden floor. For many, it would be just another morning. For me, every little detail was an anchor in a world that often seemed too chaotic. My name is Lucas, and I'm a programmer. I've always enjoyed working with code, where the rules are clear, the logic is relentless, and everything makes sense. Unlike life outside my computer. There, casual smiles, jokes between colleagues, and informal conversations felt like unsolvable riddles. I tried, of course. I worked for years to fit in, but it was never enough. At work, I was known as the genius of logic, a reputation that should have been gratifying, but came at a cost. People admired me, but kept their distance. Some said I was difficult. Others thought I was just shy. No one really understood, and I didn't have the words to explain. One afternoon, during our weekly meeting, everything changed. Greg, my boss, asked for my opinion on a feature we were developing. He was the opposite of me, charismatic, direct, always ready to crack a joke. People gravitated around him. As for me, I just wanted to fade into the background. "Lucas, what do you think of the proposal?" Greg asked, with a smile that seemed to beg for a diplomatic answer. I looked at the whiteboard where the diagrams were disorganized. My instinct was to be honest. "I don't think this approach will work. We need to restart the planning." The silence in the room was crushing. I saw my colleagues exchange glances, some frowning, others looking uncomfortable. Greg laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. "Well, that's a direct view. Let's discuss other ideas." That day, Greg called me into his office. He tried to be kind, but his words hurt more than I expected. "Lucas, you're brilliant, but we need to work on how you communicate. People feel disconnected from you." Disconnected. That word echoed in my mind. For days, I thought about what he had said, trying to figure out what I could change. In the end, there was no time for that. 2 weeks later, I was called to HR. The company was restructuring, and my position was no longer necessary. They praised me, thanked me for my contribution, but the message was clear. I wasn't the type of person who fit in. That night, I sat on the sofa in the dark room, the only light coming from the turned-off TV. It was as if the world was telling me something I had always feared. Maybe the problem was me. It was Sofia, my older sister, who first noticed the weight I was carrying. She always knew when something was wrong with me, even when I didn't say anything. After listening to me vent about work and my sense of inadequacy, she set her teacup down on the table and looked me in the eyes. "Lucas, I think you're being too hard on yourself. Maybe there's more to this than you think." "More how?" I asked, skeptical. Sofia was practical and direct, but she always saw angles I didn't. "You've always been different, you know? Since you were a kid. That was never a bad thing. Maybe it's time to understand why." The idea stayed with me. In the following days, I started researching online, but the amount of information was overwhelming. Social difficulties returned thousands of results, from introversion to anxiety disorders. That's when a specific term started to pop up: autism. I hesitated. Autism? I always thought it was something obvious, associated with extreme behaviors that showed up in childhood. But as I read articles and personal stories, something began to resonate. A preference for routines, difficulty interpreting facial expressions, discomfort with unexpected changes. It was like looking into a mirror. I spent days obsessively reading about late diagnoses in adults. Each story felt like a piece of the puzzle I didn't know I was trying to put together. Still, I hesitated to accept that this could be the answer. That's when Sofia introduced me to Marta. She's a friend of mine who was recently diagnosed with autism, she explained. I thought you two could talk. I met Marta at a quiet cafe in the city center. She had short brown hair and wore round-framed glasses, which gave her a warm, approachable look. When she started speaking, it felt like she was describing my life. For years, I thought I was just weird, she said, fiddling with her teacup. I preferred to be alone, obsessed over details, and avoided social situations whenever I could. But there was more to it. It wasn't just introversion. How did you find out? I asked, trying to hide my nervousness. A therapist suggested an evaluation. First, it was scary. But when I got the diagnosis, it was like putting together a puzzle. For the first time, I understood that there was nothing wrong with me. I just functioned differently. Her words stayed with me long after we parted. I went home with a mix of relief and fear. Relief because I might have found an explanation. Fear because I knew that if confirmed, this new reality would change everything. That night, after hours of reflection, I finally gathered the courage. I called the office of a specialist Marta had recommended and made an appointment. I needed answers. Dr. Michael Carter's office was welcoming, but even so, my nervousness was at its peak. I sat in one of the comfortable chairs in the waiting room, trying to ignore the ticking clock that seemed to amplify my anxiety. I wondered if I was overreacting, if there was really something wrong with me, or if it was just an excuse my mind had made up to justify years of disconnection. "Lucas?" called a gentle receptionist, pointing to the door. I took a deep breath and stood up. Dr. Carter was a middle-aged man with a calm and assured presence. His eyes conveyed empathy, which immediately made me feel a little more at ease. He gestured for me to sit in the armchair next to his desk. The surroundings were understated, decorated in soft colors, with no excessive distractions. "So, Lucas," he began in a calm tone, "what brought you here today?" I hesitated, trying to organize my thoughts. I've always felt different. I began, my voice a bit shaky. People say I'm good at what I do, but socially it feels like I'm always out of place. Like something is missing in me. Dr. Carter listened attentively as I spoke. Slowly, I started feeling more comfortable opening up about old memories and situations that still haunted me. The isolation in childhood, the exhaustion after social interactions, the panic at unexpected changes. He asked pointed questions, each one creating more space for reflections I had never articulated before. "Lucas," he said after a while, "based on what you've described, there's a strong possibility that you're on the autism spectrum. Naturally, we'll need further assessments to confirm, but many of your reports are consistent with the diagnosis." The words hung in the air for a few seconds, as if time had stopped. A part of me already knew, but hearing it from a specialist was different. It was real. My heart raced. "Does this mean I'm defective?" I asked, hesitant. Dr. Carter smiled gently and shook his head.
"No, Lucas.
It simply means you process the world differently. Autism is not a disability in the sense that many people think. It's a spectrum, and everyone on the spectrum has their own strengths and challenges. Your way of thinking, your patterns, your attention to detail, all of that is part of who you are. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just unique." Despite the calm in his explanation, I still felt an inner turmoil. It was like all the pieces were starting to fall into place. But at the same time, the final puzzle was bigger than I had imagined. Before I left, he handed me a list of recommended readings and suggested I join a support group for adults on the spectrum. I thanked him, but deep down, I wasn't sure if I was ready to take that step. As I walked home, Dr. Carter's words echoed in my mind. There was nothing wrong with me. I was just different. The following days were a mix of discoveries and uncertainties. I obsessively read the books and articles Dr. Carter had suggested. Each page seemed like a window into parts of myself I had never understood. The accounts of late-diagnosed adults were eerily familiar. The relief of finding an explanation, the difficulty of accepting the label, the fear of how this would change how others saw them. Sofia was the first person I shared the diagnosis with. We were at her house, having coffee in the kitchen while the smell of freshly baked cake filled the air. She looked at me with that careful gaze she always had, waiting for me to speak. "So, Dr. Carter thinks I'm on the autism spectrum," I said hesitantly. Sofia placed her mug on the table and looked at me. "That makes so much sense, Lucas," she said with a smile that mixed surprise and understanding. "You've always been unique. That was never a bad thing, you know? But how are you feeling about it?" I took a deep breath before answering. "It's a relief in a way, but it's also scary. Feels like everything makes sense now, but how will people see me from now on? Will they treat me differently?" Sofia took my hand. "You're the same Lucas as always. The people who really matter will understand. And the ones who don't, well, they don't matter." The conversation with Sofia was a relief, but talking to my parents was another story. They were much more traditional, and I knew it would take time for them to process something like this. The night I told them dinner was quiet, I waited until everyone had finished eating before speaking. "I need to tell you something important," I began, my voice hesitant. "I went to the doctor and he said I'm on the autism spectrum." My father furrowed his brow. "Autism? That doesn't make sense. You've always been normal, just a bit reserved." My mother seemed equally confused. "But you're so smart, Lucas. How can this be autism?" "It has nothing to do with intelligence," I explained, trying to stay calm. "It's about how my brain works. It explains why some things have always been difficult for me." Sofia intervened as she always did. "Dad, Mom, Lucas is just trying to understand himself better. This doesn't change anything about him. He's still the same Lucas." My father shook his head, as if he still didn't know what to think. My mother remained silent, her gaze lost. Even though they had listened, I felt the process of understanding would be slow. It was Marta who helped me find clarity on this. During a walk in the park, while we tossed pieces of bread to the birds, I vented about my parents' reaction. "It takes time," she said, with the serene tone she always had. "People struggle to accept things they don't understand, but you can't measure your journey by their pace." I knew she was right, but it was still hard. However, when she suggested I try the support group, something inside me pushed me to say yes. Maybe hearing other people's stories was exactly what I needed. The support group meeting took place on a cold night, and my anxiety was already at its peak before I even entered the room. The building was simple, with a discreet sign indicating the location. I hesitantly opened the door, greeted by a man with a friendly smile. He seemed to know I was new there. "You're Lucas, right?" he said, extending his hand.
I'm Peter. Welcome.
"Make yourself comfortable. Everyone here knows how tough the first day can be." The room was arranged in a circle of chairs, some occupied by people speaking in low tones. I sat in a corner, trying not to attract attention. Little by little, the group began sharing stories. There were young people, older adults, people from different backgrounds, but each seemed to carry a story of struggle similar to mine. A woman named Amy spoke about how she had finally found a job at an inclusive company after years of rejections. "The hardest part," she said, "is not just convincing others that you're capable, but convincing yourself." Peter shared how he discovered his diagnosis only at 40, after years of feeling strange. "I spent so much time trying to be someone I wasn't, that when I finally accepted myself, I realized the world around me needed to change, not me." His words resonated deeply with me. As I listened, I realized I wasn't alone, that my struggles were shared by others. This brought unexpected comfort, but also a weight. I knew the road ahead would still be long. That week, I decided to take a step forward and start looking for a new job. Sofia helped me again, reviewing my resume and encouraging me to be more open about my needs. "You don't have to tell them everything, Lucas," she said, "but showing that you understand how you function is a strength, not a weakness." I sent resumes to several companies, and within a few days, I received interview invitations. My first attempt, however, wasn't easy. The company was a promising startup, and the interview started well, but when the recruiter asked how I handled unexpected changes, my mind went blank. I knew the honest answer would be, "I don't handle it well," but I tried to cover it up, and my hesitation was evident. "I prefer to work with clear planning," I finally said, but my voice sounded more like an apology than a statement. When the interview ended, I walked out feeling defeated. The old feeling of inadequacy hit me hard. No matter how hard I tried, it seemed like the world wasn't ready for people like me. I told Marta about the experience during a conversation in the park. "Sometimes it feels like no matter how much I try, I'll always be the odd one out," I vented. "Lucas," she said, stopping and looking directly at me. "It's not that you're the odd one out. It's that people are used to a certain pattern, and anything different scares them. But that doesn't mean you don't belong. It just means you haven't found the right place yet." Her words stayed with me. Maybe she was right. Maybe the problem wasn't me, but the world around me. Sofia found an opening at a company known for valuing diversity in the workplace, including neurodiversity. "Look at this, Lucas," she said excitedly. "They have inclusion programs and really seem to understand the needs of people like you." At first, I hesitated. After the previous failure, I wasn't sure I was ready to face another rejection. But something inside me, maybe Marta's voice echoing in my mind, told me to try. I prepared my resume with even more care this time. I highlighted my technical skills, attention to detail, and analytical approach. But I also wrote a short paragraph explaining how I like to work, with clear structures and direct communication. It was a risk, but I felt I needed to be honest. The interview was different from the start. The recruiter, a man named David, began asking practical questions, focusing on my previous work and how I approached problems. When he asked how I preferred to receive feedback, I answered confidently, "In an objective and specific way. It helps me adjust my work without confusion." He smiled. "I like your clarity. It's rare to find someone who knows their own needs so well." When the interview ended, David shook my hand and said, "Lucas, it was a pleasure meeting you. We'll be in touch soon." That night, I felt a spark of hope that I hadn't felt in a long time. And a few days later, I received the call. I had gotten the job. The work environment was everything I had hoped for and more. My supervisor, Karen, greeted me with a warm smile and began the initial meeting by asking, "How can we ensure you feel comfortable and supported here?" I explained my preferences. A quiet space, clear instructions, and predictable hours. She made notes and said, "We can do that, no problem." The weeks that followed were transformative. For the first time, I felt that my way of thinking was not just accepted but valued. My focus on details and my ability to solve complex problems began to stand out. However, the biggest test came when Karen asked me to lead a presentation about a project I was developing. The idea of speaking in front of the whole team, and potentially the directors, paralyzed me. Public speaking had always been one of my greatest difficulties. "Lucas, you understand this project better than anyone," Karen said. "I know you can do this." That night, I called Marta for support. "I'm going to freeze," I said, my voice trembling. "I can't do this." "You can," she replied firmly. "Remember, you don't need to be perfect. Just be yourself. And if something goes wrong, it's okay. It's just a presentation, not the end of the world." With her words in mind, I began rehearsing obsessively. The night before the presentation, I couldn't sleep, but something inside me told me I had to do this, not just for work, but for myself. On the day of the presentation, anxiety took over like never before. I arrived early at the office, reviewing my slides for the 100th time and mentally repeating the key points. My hands were sweating, and my heart was pounding so fast it was hard to think clearly. I wondered if I should have insisted that someone more experienced take over the task. But deep down, I knew that running away would be worse. The meeting room was spacious, with large windows letting in natural light. Slowly, the directors began to arrive. Karen gave me a subtle smile of encouragement while organizing the papers on the table. The serious faces of the executives intimidated me, but I tried to focus on why I was there: to present a technical solution that could solve an important problem for the company. "Shall we begin?" Karen said, signaling that it was my turn. I stood up slowly, feeling every eye in the room focused on me. I took a deep breath and took the first step. I started with what I knew best, the data. I used my attention to detail to explain the problem in a structured way, presenting graphs and numbers that justified my solution. However, in the middle of the presentation, one of the directors, Richard, raised his hand. "Lucas, your solution is interesting, but what if we encounter an unexpected issue along the way? How do you plan to handle that?" My mind froze for a moment. The fear of saying something wrong grew. But suddenly, I remembered what Marta had said. "You don't need to be perfect. Just be yourself." I took a deep breath, organized my thoughts, and responded, "If there's an unexpected issue, the framework I proposed is flexible enough to be adjusted. Additionally, I can develop additional tools to monitor any changes and create specific solutions for each situation." Richard nodded, seeming satisfied. The rest of the presentation went more smoothly, and when I finished, I was met with a brief silence, followed by spontaneous applause. "Lucas," Richard said with a rare smile, "your presentation was clear and extremely practical. Excellent work." Karen shot me a proud look, as if saying, "I knew you could do it." I felt a huge sense of relief and, more than that, a feeling of accomplishment I hadn't experienced in a long time. That day, something changed inside me. I realized that the key wasn't to be like others, but to find a way to show the world what I could offer exactly as I am. With the success of the presentation, my role in the company gained even more importance. Colleagues began seeking me out for help on projects, and for the first time in my professional life, I didn't feel like an outsider. My confidence grew every day, and the inclusive environment at the company helped me explore my potential. But despite my positive journey, I knew not everyone was as fortunate. During a meeting at the support group, I heard Amy venting, "I got a job, but it's so hard to explain my needs. It feels like no one wants to listen." Her words made me remember my own struggles in the past. I thought about how many times I had been rejected or misunderstood before finding a place where I could thrive. I decided I wanted to do something about it. I spoke with Marta about creating an initiative focused on the inclusion of neurodivergent individuals in the job market. The idea is to educate companies on how to support people on the autism spectrum, I explained. "I want to share what I've learned and create a path for others." Marta was excited. "This is amazing, Lucas. I think we can start with talks in smaller companies and then expand." Together, we began planning workshops and educational events. Our first workshop took place at a small local company. I remember the room full of managers and recruiters, many of them curious, others clearly skeptical. As I began speaking, I felt the familiar anxiety rising, but this time, it was different. I wasn't there to prove my worth. I was there to share my story. I spent years feeling like there was no place for me in the professional world. I began. But what I've learned is that being different isn't a weakness. It's a strength. All we need is a little understanding and support. I shared the challenges I had faced, my late diagnosis, and how my current company had allowed me to thrive. Gradually, the skeptical looks began to soften. At the end, a manager came up to me. "Thank you for sharing your story," she said. "I have a daughter who was recently diagnosed, and hearing you gave me hope that she can also find her place in the world." That moment stayed with me. It was proof that my experiences could make an impact, that my journey wasn't just about me, but about opening doors for others. In the following months, the workshops grew in reach. We began receiving invitations from larger companies, and our message of inclusion started spreading. Each talk, each conversation was an opportunity to change people's perceptions. At the end of one of the events, while we were packing up the materials, Marta looked at me and said, "Do you realize what you're doing, right? You're creating a world where people like us can be seen and valued." Smiling, I replied, "I'm just getting started." When I look back, I see how my journey was full of challenges, but also learning and growth. Today, I know that the pieces I thought were missing were never absent. They were always there, waiting to be seen for what they truly were. And as the sun set that day, I realized something important. I hadn't just found my place in the world, I had helped build one.